Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Footnote Fantasy Animation podcast episode with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So we are doing something that I feel like we've not really talked about pantomime in various guises. We've sort of talked about sound and performance and the body and there's something that sort of maybe pantomime touches a lot of different kind of fantasy animation elements that we haven't sort of thought through, but I will defer to you on pantomime. So we've got I'm imagining some long sort of genealogy with certain kinds of things. I'm trying to think of maybe how pantomime fits with animation. Animation is often considered kind of pantomimic. I'm thinking early animation, but I'll start with a timer. Let's do pantomime.
Well, I guess I should say here, this is not something I have a huge amount of expertise in, but it's something I've come across in scholarship that I'll try to give you the footnote version of. But I guess we're using the word pantomime on this footnote to talk about a variety of different theatrical traditions that emerge in popular entertainment in the sort of 17th to late 19th century and that become very influential on at least early film and the way early film is made.
Yes.
And are very influential on the kind of legacy and history of fantasy on the stage, but also just fantasy kind of dramatic storytelling techniques more broadly. So I guess those traditions, I guess it goes back, as most things do, to kind of classical antiquity and the kind of role of gesture and movement in kind of those kind of, choric dramas and comedies. But really, I guess there are three things we could play with. They're all European. There's the commedia dell'arte, an Italian kind of form of theatre in which performers relied on kind of masks and often played kind of stock characters like the Harlequin, things like that. There's the French féerie play, which is really, really important, and really we could just have called it that really today, but we're going to call it pantomime because hey, we're English and have therefore colonised all of this legacy under that term. But that kind of emerges in the late 17th and early 18th century in France. These are much more elaborate productions. They're often quite technically sophisticated, and they're based on fairy tale narratives all the time. So they have things like fantastical transformation, magical monsters,
so early kind of
special effects. Special video effects. Loads of kind of innovative stagecraft takes place during this time to kind of transform and bring to life these stories on screen. And they're using fairy tales largely so that it's almost like it's kind of a melodramatic it's almost got kind of like a melodramatic logic to it, right? In that melodrama is meant to be like scene to scene to scene, like spectacular moment to spectacular moment to dramatic moment to dramatic moment. It's all about jumping between different moments and tableaus. This is trying to do that, but with particularly effects heavy thing, using fantasy and fairy stories in particular. And just to pause on that, these are also extremely influential on filmmakers like Georges Méliès.
I was just
who in many ways sees himself as a maker of fairy plays and sees what he's doing with cinema as a continuation of that craft form.
Yeah.
And then all of these create something broadly called pantomime that emerges during like the kind of 18th century in Britain, very popular in the Victorian era, and it draws on the French play. It draws on the kind of theatricality of the commedia dell'arte. It throws in a bit of kind of music hall influence and creates this popular art form that, for those who are not in this country, still to this day, the tradition of going to see the Christmas pantomime is a tradition many families will engage with as part of their kind of Christmas experience. So that's the history. Should we pause there?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to sort of think about the ways that I have encountered pantomime through animation, and my first thought was sort of gags and humour and a particular kind of pantomimic expression of so lots of people that are writing around kind of animation talk about sort of animation and gags and humour and the pantomime as a kind of special art form that really thrives on, performance and humour, and particularly kinds of, certainly as you said in this country at Christmas time, kind of a really, I don't want to say stale humour, but a really sort of
it's a certain type of humour, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't quite.
I mean, there are pantomimes, particularly here in London, where the form is used to do something very often provocative or interesting. There's always the kind of, is it the Peckham pantomime that always tries to kind of deal with some kind of issue that's happened over the last year through the pantomime form. The London Palladium will often have, big comedians and things in it. So it's not, I know what you mean when you say stale, in the sense that I associate with going to kind of community theatres as a child and watching things like that. But it's still quite a live and fresh form that a lot of people enjoy.
So one of the earliest, a figure that we've never really talked about on the podcast, and who often gets forgotten within animation history, but one of the first people to write. So he wrote a book. Edwin George Lutz, E.G. Lutz, wrote a book in the 1920s called Animated Cartoons, How They Are Made, Their Origin, and something else, can't remember the rest of the title, but talks about pantomime. So it was interesting that I think a lot of the early writing on animation in the 20s, when it was trying to figure out where it came from, linking it to Victorian children's toys, to parlour games where we did the lightning sketch cartoon, pantomime was a frame of reference. And I'm wondering whether that was to do, I mean, he talks about an animated cartoon, clever in gesturing, is understood by all races. And then talks about a pantomime is, in the next sentence, it is to be remembered that pantomime is a matter of interpretation on the stage. So he's talking about the universality of pantomime, but I'm wondering, when he's trying to articulate the kinds of humour that animation embodies, but also emphasis on gesture and performance, that it's this sort of staging is particularly important to early animation.
There's also a knowingness to pantomime that kind of crops up here and there.
It's about pantomime.
Well, it's there's always there are pantomime stock characters.
Yes.
So there's the dame, who's always a person in drag.
Yeah, always.
And they're usually like the mother of the hero, right? So Widow Twankey is probably the most famous. And is that Aladdin that Widow Twankey's in or something like that?
So.
But yeah. And then there's the principal boy, that's traditionally played by a woman, who will be the lead. So Aladdin would be played by a woman traditionally. And these stock characters are kind of bolted onto a fairy tale story in a kind of delightfully idiosyncratic manner, right? So like it's the fairy tale that but not quite, because it has all these kind of surrounding characters. Like Cinderella has buttons, these kind of characters that aren't in the thing and don't have the same status as the characters in the story, but then oddly, and this links to some of the stuff we talked about recently, but oddly they have more status in the kind of affective quality of the story, because those characters often will engage in a kind of call and response with the audience, right? So whilst the leading boy, Aladdin, like the main characters, the Cinderellas, the Sleeping Beauties, the handsome princes, have to kind of remain quite po-faced and quite kind of committed to the drama, the Widow Twankies, the buttons, talk to the audience. They stop the pantomime to play a game usually at some point. There's various games we're supposed to play with them, isn't there? The It's Behind You game.
Yeah.
Oh no, was it? I've been a while.
Oh no, it isn't.
Oh no, yes it is. You're supposed to kind of respond back to the thing. So there's a weird thing going on where the characters of low status within the fiction, who constantly slip between telling the story and being in the story, are kind of the ones to be with us in the audience.
But I'm also thinking about those. So a quick Google tells me pantomime blanche, so the French art form of mime, using white painted faces with black features to express stories silently. Now, a lot of kind of writers have talked about. This is from Gaines's work, The Routledge Complaint to Jacques Lecoq, who talks about the fast-paced rhythms of Chuck Jones cartoons, whose absurd imagery lent itself to the language of pantomime blanche. So I'm thinking of all the times Wile E. Coyote or whatever looks to the camera, and those kinds of acknowledgements seem to be a very pantomimic expression to break the fourth wall and to sort of implicate the audience, like they're performing the role of Buttons, who is, because there's always in a pantomime like a community song where they sort of get together. It's not just the characters singing a song, they invite the audience. There's awareness that there's an audience that's part of this process, part of this spectacle. And so I'm wondering whether the types of humor, but also the kind of reflexive gestures within, which are rife throughout early animations, particularly into the Golden Age, are very closely connected to pantomime as a form of implicating an audience or watching watching audience. We have a minute and a half left.
Oh right, okay. Well, I better give you some books to read then. Give you your homework. So yeah, there's I mean, you talked about there was an animation text you mentioned. I've forgotten its name already.
Oh, Lutz's, yeah.
Fine. So there's I think Donald Crafton's Before Mickey talks a little bit about kind of at least the broader tradition of theatrical traditions and how it links to early cartoons. A really good book is Film and Fairy Tales: The Birth of Modern Fantasy by Christian Moyne, who traces this legacy and explores how it goes right up to something like Snow White, how some of these things are feeding into some of the most beloved fantasy stories of modern cinema, right? And in many ways we could see Snow White as a continuation of the French fairy plays, to desire to kind of marvel us with technical power and superiority. It's kind of still doing that, although in different ways. So those are two good ones.
Okay, yeah, I will only throw in Crafton's other book, The Shadow of a Mouse, which is more anchored to performance.
Okay.
And so I'm pretty certain there would be references, like he's interested in the performing body of animation. So,
and then of course there's I won't cite them because there's so many, but like there's a wealth of material just on pantomime that you could find, any kind of good reference library. But we're just those are the ones that are kind of actually related to film and animation, which are our main area of focus.
Done.
All right.
Yes. Look at that. 3 seconds to go.
Okay. No, it isn't.
Awful.
Anyway,
you nearly went the whole way through without doing that.
Oh yes, it is. Right. Yeah, that's been Pantomimes. That's been us. If you want to have suggestions for other Footnote episodes, you can email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.